The world we live in is full of things we don't understand. Being the curious humans that we are, we naturally try and seek these things out. Doing so has led us to remarkable discoveries and inventions that we could never have imagined 100 years ago. We've defeated disease, built to the sky itself, and even created machines that could take us beyond the clouds and into the stars. If our ancestors could see us and what we've created, I'm sure many of them would see us as gods. Our innate curiosity and lust for knowledge has not always led us to greatness, however. True evil and darkness have also been uncovered in humanity's conquest of knowledge. And in the end, I fear this evil will be our doom. I don't say this from the standpoint of a great philosopher who has sat and simply pondered things either. No. I say this because I have seen it, experienced it. I was a part of it. The event I'm about to relay to you is true in its entirety. This I swear. I feel certain this will fall on deaf ears, and many of you will believe this to be just another spooky story meant to give you cheap thrills. But I promise you, this is neither my intent nor my purpose. The purpose of this story is to simply warn you of what lurks beyond the veil of what we can see and understand, to show you what awaits us in the darkness, even if I don't understand it myself. What I'm about to tell you has happened, and I feel certain it will happen again. In 1971, a not so well-known scientist began preparations for an extremely secretive project, known simply as the Harbinger experiment. I'd like to keep the identity of the scientist a secret for personal reasons, so throughout this recounting, I'll refer to him as Zimmerman. Zimmerman's background is unclear at best beyond 1971. All that's known about him before that time is that he grew up somewhere in Maryland with a strange fascination of the occult and supernatural. This later made him an outcast among his fellow scientists, due to how scoffed upon the metaphysical was, and still is, at the time. Zimmerman's opinions concerning the otherworldly were not the sole cause for him being an outcast, though. It was his methods that made him widely unaccepted among his peers. Zimmerman was well known during his time for being ruthless and cold beyond measure. He never cared about the means. All that mattered to him was results, and if he predicted the results to be valuable enough, anything would be worth obtaining them. It was this insatiable and brutal lust for the truth that made him feared among those that knew of him. And the few that knew of him and did not fear him believed in him and followed him and his work closely. The word Harbinger itself has such a mysterious and intimidating taste to it. Maybe it's the way it rolls from our tongues, or maybe it's simply due to its association with the project. But the word always seems to carry a certain amount of doom with it, which would make sense. The word itself means to warn or forebode. I can't imagine Zimmerman's reason for giving the experiment this title, but in retrospect, it fits perfectly. Zimmerman came to a select few, me being one of them. He told us he was working on something big, and he needed people who could keep confidentiality and not spread idle gossip of his work. While he didn't fully trust some of us, he did know that we were professionals, and that for some reason or another, we were all in dire need of employment. I'd worked at the local clinic as a doctor, but I was caught stealing medication and was promptly fired. This left a very dark mark on my resume, so work was hard to find. I was also a native to Alaska and lived near where the experiment would take place, so I guess you could say I was a convenient choice. As you can imagine, I jumped at the opportunity. It was hard not to when I saw the payout. 15 of us were hired in total. Some were colleagues of his that had been working with him for a while. Some were maintenance workers, and a few were hired as private security. I was the only medical professional to be hired. It's still a wonder to me how he even attained the funds necessary for the experiment. I wouldn't be wholly surprised if his financing was not entirely legal. But legal or not, I needed the money, and he was paying. Looking back, it's a decision I've come to regret. After he obtained his money, he used it to buy a relatively large plot of land deep in the frozen wilderness of Alaska. And upon that piece of land, he built a concrete structure, not dissimilar to a bunker in fact. The sole difference being that its goal was to keep any potential damage contained within the structure, rather than keeping it out, as he put it. Most of the structure dug underneath the earth, which had the effect of making the underground complex seem so much smaller than it really was from the outside, as would be expected. There was only one way of entering and leaving the underground structure, and it was via a ladder that led from a small, unassuming concrete building on the surface, which I'll refer to from now on as the entrance building for convenience, to the network below. After everyone had gone to bed at night, the hatch that contained the ladder would be sealed off with a very large and thick metal lid. Zimmerman was very strict about this. Located not too far away from the entrance building was a series of wooden cabins that would serve as the sleeping quarters for the staff he'd hired. Compared to the entrance building standing on the surface, the underground system was massive. At the centre of the complex was the control room. This is where all of the facility's electronics and such were linked to. This included security cameras, lights and door controls. Consoles, monitors and computers lined the walls of this large central chamber. This is also where the ladder in the entrance building connected to in the underground complex. Connected to the control room were 3 doors. One led to a smaller room that served as the infirmary. Another door led to a break room, and the last door led into the hallways. The hallways are where the complex began to feel extremely eerie. For some reason, they were laid out in an extremely confusing scheme that led in circles and to complete dead ends. These hallways made up a vast majority of the complex, and it would be very easy to get lost in the maze if you were unfamiliar with it. But if you knew where you were going, you'd find yourself standing before one of 3 8 by 8 foot rooms before long. Each room had a camera hooked up to one of the corners of the room, and all 3 of those cameras were connected to a corresponding monitor in the control room. Cameras were also scattered throughout the hallways, so that whoever was watching their corresponding monitor could see anywhere they wanted to, when they wanted to. Thick metal doors stood at the entrance to each of these rooms, and in order to open them, you'd have to enter a 4-digit code into a panel located near the door. I remember when I first arrived, how badly the hallways frightened me. I've always been claustrophobic, you see, and those hallways were so very narrow. The noise, or more accurately, the lack of noise, was also a tremendous source of fear for me. It was always so unnaturally silent, as if the entire world had stopped moving. It really made you feel like you were trapped down there. Thankfully though, I only rarely ventured into these hallways, for I was the only medical professional in the facility, and I had virtually no reason to go into them. In the beginning, I found it so peculiar that he'd ask for someone like me on a project like this, but by the time it was all over, I understood why. The official purpose of the Harbinger experiment was to test and observe the effects of extended isolation on the human mind. This is what was listed on reports being sent out, at least. But unbeknownst to all those who were not participating in the project, excluding the subjects, the true purpose was much darker. Like I said before, he always had an obsession with the occult and supernatural. He sought to prove himself to those who did not believe in him. He wanted physical proof that the supernatural was a real phenomenon, and he wanted to be the first one to attain said proof. The true purpose of the Harbinger experiment was to find proof of the metaphysical, a world we could not see. The thought of doing this was naturally a tad bit daunting and even scary, but it was his method of doing so that was truly terrifying. Zimmerman believed that he would be able to open a portal between worlds momentarily, allowing 3 random entities to cross over to our world, and each one of these beings would be trapped within one of the 3 rooms. He had the theory that any entity would try and latch on to the nearest living thing that had the capacity for it. He wanted to use this technique to trap a spirit in a physical form by allowing it to enter a living being that was injected with a compound mixture of his creation. In theory, this compound would keep the entity from simply leaving whatever it was attached to. The only way it could leave a host who had been injected was through death. According to Zimmerman, the host would have to be something living, with a will strong enough to survive the possession. And there's only one known species that possess the amount of will required for this: humans. He'd also done something to ensure that the entities would only enter the 3 rooms, and that there would only be one entity in each room, though I can't say I know exactly what he did. In fact, I know next to nothing. He liked to keep his methodology a secret to his most trusted colleagues, most likely due to his paranoia. If I'd known this was the true purpose before I signed up, I may have reconsidered. But he decided not to tell us until we were all gathered at his fortress. Even if any of us wanted to leave, I doubt we would have been allowed to do so. The security team he'd hired was loyal to him and the payout. It's unlikely he would have given the order to let us to leave. There were 3 different subjects included in the experiment. All were native to Alaska, and each one was lured into the project under the belief they'd be participating in a harmless study of the effect of isolation on the human mind. That's the reason why none of them objected when they realised they'd be confined to one of the 3 rooms. The first subject was a young man. He was apparently out of work and desperately needed the money. The second was a woman. By looking at her, I could tell she was an addict of some sort. The third and final subject was an older man. A drifter, if I had to guess. One thing they all had in common was that none of them had any family or friends left. In short, no one would miss them, which is why they were chosen. I'm sorry. I wish I could supply more information about them, but all of this has been drawn from memory, and I wasn't given much information on the 3 to begin with. The experiment didn't officially begin until 1987, 16 years after its original announcement. I was eager to begin with, so I packed up and headed out to the complex as soon as I could. I arrived there a week before the subjects had even signed up, and a whole month before the project even began. I wasn't the first to arrive by any means. When I got there, Zimmerman, his colleagues and the security team had already arrived. I suppose you could say I was among the people that Zimmerman didn't trust to arrive first. On October 15th, 1987, all the preparations were in place. The subjects had been sealed in their rooms. The cameras, lights and speakers were fully operational, and all the staff members had settled in. The time had come for the experiment to officially begin. He asked everyone to report to the control room around 9 PM to witness the beginning of the experiment. He wanted everyone to be present when he proved that all of his theories had been correct and he wasn't just a madman. He wanted us all to see the fruits of his labour. When everyone had finally gathered in the large control room, he turned to us and simply said, "Observe." He then turned his back to us, leaned into the microphone, and then he began chanting in a strange language that I feel certain that no one but him could understand. We all observed the 3 large monitors on the walls, silently waiting for something to happen. The subjects all stood in their rooms, dumbstruck by his chanting, staring at the monitors with confused expressions on their faces. After about 5 minutes, I felt something awful. I can't explain what exactly it was, but a horrible feeling of dread washed over me, riddling me with fear. It was then that the ground actually began to shake subtly, and the lights began to flicker. Zimmerman continued chanting into the microphone as if nothing was off or wrong, while the subjects began dashing around their rooms, screaming for help. Then suddenly, the ground stopped shaking, and the monitor's image turned into static. The air began to become very heavy as we all stared at the monitors, waiting for them to regain their image and show us what was happening, or had happened, in those 3 rooms. For a while, all was silent, but then there was screaming. The screams of a woman going through unbearable pain began to echo through the compound. The similar screams of men began to coincide with the woman's terrified screams, and together they mixed into an awful symphony of pain and fear that beat mercilessly into our ears. Those of us who were here for the money began to give each other scared looks, while those loyal to Zimmerman seemed completely unfazed. We wanted to leave and never come back to this awful place, but we all knew deep down he'd never allow that to happen. We were here for the long haul. There was no escape. It was 10:13 PM when the screaming finally stopped. The monitors had yet to reveal to us what occurred in those 3 rooms. As soon as the screaming ended, he stood and dismissed us all for the night, adding that we were all forbidden to come back into the compound until 10 AM the following morning. Not like any of us wanted to. We all solemnly made our way out of the compound and towards the cabins, and settled in for the night. I feel it's safe to say that not all of us slept well that night, and I was not one of them. The following morning, all of the staff had arrived at the entrance building. We all stood inside, exchanging tired or nervous looks as we waited for him to arrive and open the hatch that concealed the ladder. I could see palpable fear in the eyes of some of us, while others didn't seem to have even been remotely affected by what happened last night. Zimmerman showed up 5 minutes after 10, apologising for his tardiness. He opened the hatch, and without any hesitation, he began descending the ladder downwards into the black abyss. He almost seemed enthusiastic. I was the first to follow behind Zimmerman's dark descent into the facility. It seemed that the farther I climbed down, the more the darkness closed in on me, as if it was trying to swallow me whole. And as I climbed deeper, I couldn't help but feel that this place was different somehow. While before, there was only the unsettling concrete hallways and rooms, now there was something else. Something made the eeriness feel so real and personified. I felt like a horrible and gruesome scene awaited us down there, but I continued climbing downwards, despite my fear and my hesitation. This was no longer just a spooky bunker. There was darkness and malevolence in the air. A true evil now lived here, and I could feel it. We all could. I finally felt my foot touch ground and let out a silent sigh of relief. Almost as if on cue, the light bulbs came alive, dousing the room in their warm and welcome light. He must have turned on the power, I thought. I allowed myself to take a couple of seconds to examine the control room. It was exactly as we'd left it last night, for which I gave a silent and thankful prayer. It was almost as if nothing unusual happened. I shook myself from those thoughts as I remembered the static-filled monitors from the night before. I let my eyes slowly make their way towards the monitors on the wall, anticipating the grim and fearful scenes that would be on them. My attention was first grabbed by monitor 1 and 3, which was still pure static. It would have been a small relief, but then the motionless image on monitor 2 caught my eye. Room 2 was entirely still, and everything seemed entirely untouched. I couldn't help but gasp as I noticed the only thing that was different. The woman lay in the centre of the small concrete room. An expression of fear and terror was frozen into her gaunt face as she lay silent and lifeless on her back. Zimmerman's expression turned angry when he saw this. He ordered that the second monitor be turned off, and it was. We didn't ask why. It's not like any of us wanted to see the dreadful scene any longer. He also ordered that if the images in monitors 1 and 3 didn't return in the next 2 hours, the security team would be sent to investigate. The team nodded. They made it seem as if they had no fear, but I could see it in their eyes. The subtly loud tick of the clock was the only sound that echoed through the control room while I stared at the monitors. An hour and 50 minutes had gone by, and all I could see was static. All of the other staff members were working except me. This was because the project had been completely injury-free so far, so I essentially had nothing to do but wait for someone to hurt themselves. Zimmerman, a couple of his colleagues and I were the only ones that occupied the room. They quietly chatted amongst each other on the other side, while I spent my time reading and pondering the situation I currently found myself in. I'd clearly made a mistake coming here. The corpse lying in room 2 was evidence enough of this. And God only knew what awaited us in rooms 1 and 3. My thoughts were soon interrupted as monitor 3's image returned. The clear image, now displayed on the screen, made everyone's eyes noticeably widen. What was displayed on the monitor was horrifying. A humanoid thing stood in the centre of the room, staring directly at the camera, unmoving. It was wearing the jumpsuit that Subject 3 had been issued. But this clearly wasn't the same man that entered. What caught my attention first was its eyes. They were solid black and twice the size of normal human eyes. They seemed so endless and so cold. Its head had also grown with the eyes in such a symmetrical and unsettling manner. The being had shed all of its hair, and even from the monitor, I could see how unnaturally smooth and clear its skin was. It had also seemingly grown in height and stature, which could be seen in the fact that the jumpsuit was obviously too small. Its limbs had grown especially long. Its arms hung almost as low as the creature's knees. What we were looking at was in no way the same man we sent inside. Fear. Fear was all I felt as I continued to stare into the monitor at the thing in the room. And my fear seemed to be shared by those around me, which made me feel kind of good. It may sound awful, but it was a bit satisfying to see that Zimmerman and his colleagues could feel fear too. But at the same time, it was worrying, because this showed that this was not part of his plan. Something had gone wrong. We all stared into the monitor, despite our fear. It was almost as if we were in a trance. My already present fear began to grow and spread rapidly through my body as I became lost in the creature's eyes, trapped in its terrifyingly hypnotic gaze. After what felt like forever, I managed to break eye contact with the creature and divert my attention from the monitor. And when I did so, I felt my fear levels drop considerably. After a short while, he ordered his security team to make their way to Subject 1's door, just as he said he would do. They left without question, armed only with batons and pistols. I focused my attention on watching the men progress through the hallways towards Subject 1's room via the cameras. Even through the not so high quality cameras, it wasn't hard to tell that these men were afraid of what awaited them. Their heads were downcast as they walked. They didn't possess the same confidence within them that they did when this project began. They looked like scared boys being sent off to a terrible war. Eventually, they made it to the door. We had perfect vision of them and the door via the hallway camera. One of them said something through one of their walkie-talkies and made a motion towards the camera. In response, one of Zimmerman's colleagues buzzed the door open. The men already had their pistols out by the time the button was pushed. Slowly, the door began to open. We all watched eagerly as the men began to approach the door, guns aimed inside. Suddenly, without warning, there was a loud shriek, and as something bounded out of the room at the men, the monitor turned into static. Immediately, we could hear screaming echoing down the hallways, followed shortly after by the distinct sound of gunshots. We could do nothing but wait. After a couple of minutes, the screaming and the gunshots stopped. We all waited and prayed, hoping that whatever bounded at them from the room wouldn't be the one to return to the control room. After a couple more minutes, 3 of the men came back, carrying with them the corpse of the 4th. He had massive cuts covering his chest, and his face was shredded. You couldn't even tell who he was anymore, or even that he was human. I was so used to gore, being a doctor and all, so I felt somewhat unfazed by the mass of shredded flesh and bloodied meat that they carried with them. But many of the others went pale and vomited. The security team all wore emotionless expressions and eyes filled with terror. One of the men finally looked up at us. He stared at us for a while with those wide eyes of his. "It's dead," he finally managed to mutter in a shaken and scared voice. A couple of hours went by. The dead man's name was Frank. He was buried outside in the cold Alaskan ground. 2 of the men were unharmed, physically at least. The 3rd was alive, but only barely. I managed to stabilize him, but only just. The other 2 men vaguely explained what happened. Apparently, Subject 1 leaped out at Frank after the door had opened. Only it wasn't really Subject 1 anymore. According to them, it had a hideously contorted face and long, sharp claws. They claimed to have shot it over a dozen times before it fell dead. And then, they emptied another dozen bullets into it, just to be sure it was really dead. Only once it was dead did they come back. After tending to the wounded man, I went to investigate the monitors. As afraid as I was of seeing what those monitors may have held, I needed to see. Subject 3 was the only one left now, and I needed to see it and make sure the creature was still in its room. It seemed to be more like a jail cell than an ordinary room at this point though, which was probably a good thing. The cameras displaying Subject 1's room and the hallway outside it still displayed a static-filled screen. No one was sent to repair them or investigate. We just had to hope that Subject 1 was well and truly dead. Monitor 3's image was exactly the same as I'd left it. Subject 3 was still staring directly into the camera at us. He was still in the exact same position, and if it were not for the small fan in the corner of the room, I'd think I was looking at a still image. In a way, I felt relief at seeing this. Relief that he was still in his room and hadn't escaped while no one was looking. After everything quieted down, I noticed something especially unusual. There was a strange sound emanating from somewhere. At first, it was barely noticeable. The only reason I heard it was because of how extremely quiet it was in the infirmary. But as time went by, it slowly began to increase in volume. After about an hour, it was loud enough that everyone else could hear it too. And after a couple more hours, its volume had increased so much that we could determine what the noise was. It was a song. Apparently, his father loved the song and listened to it frequently. The song seemed to be on a loop and kept replaying itself. Although we were able to identify the noise, we remained unable to identify its source. We knew it wasn't coming from the speakers because we'd turned them off. It seemed to be emitting from the walls themselves. More time ticked by as we all began to become increasingly agitated by the song. I spent most of my time in the infirmary attending to Frank or in the control room. Fear hung in the air, and the presence of unmistakable darkness and evil was no doubt its source. Subject 3 still had not moved. He kept his unblinking gaze fixed on the camera the entire time. It always felt like he was staring directly at me, no matter where I was in the room. I think this effect was also felt by others, due to the fact that they seemed to move around the room a lot, and for seemingly no reason. After a few hours, the song was so loud that people almost had to shout in order to communicate. We'd been trying to find its source so we could turn it off, but it was to no avail. The source was completely unidentifiable. This added a level of extreme irritation to our already very present fear. It was around 8:30 that the ground itself began to shake once again, just as it had the previous night. Panic began to spread among my fellow employees and I, as the shaking grew in intensity. During this, I had the sudden instinctual feeling to look over at Subject 3's monitor. It was gone. Almost as if on cue, the power went out. And thankfully, the song did as well. Ever since the security team came back, panic had been slowly building up among the staff, and Zimmerman was powerless to stop it. When those lights went out, the calm projections that everyone had been trying to maintain left us, and the fear in all of our hearts took over. The emergency backup lights kicked on shortly after the power went out, which I gave a silent, thankful prayer for. The lights were dim, but they still allowed me to see a lot. Total panic seized us, as many of my fellow staff members began screaming and rushing to the ladder in an attempt to escape. But too many were trying to use it at once, and no one was able to get very far without someone else pulling them to the floor and taking their place. Zimmerman was shouting for everyone to calm down, but his dominating and intimidating personality had no effect here, and his demands fell upon deaf ears. It was total chaos. It wasn't long until people actually started hurting each other in their desperate attempts to get up that ladder and out of this place. I could only stand against the wall and wait for my opportunity to escape up the ladder. All the screams were soon silenced as the familiar hum of that unsettling song began to rise in volume again, only much quicker this time. And this time, it was clear that the noise was coming directly from the maze-like corridors. People stopped fighting and shouting as all of our attention shifted to the door that led into the hallways. The song quickly got louder than it ever had been before, which forced many of us to cup our ears with our hands in an attempt to silence the noise. Then, suddenly, the song just completely stopped. Silence. That was all that filled the room, as we all stared at the thick metal door in anticipation for what was coming. It felt like ages had gone by, but in reality, it was probably only seconds before the silence was broken. The door suddenly and violently burst open, and the music started again, louder than it ever had been before. The suddenness and the volume caused many of us to recoil by falling to the ground and grabbing our ears in an attempt to block out the noise. I glanced up for just a second, and in the doorway stood a tall, smooth-skinned figure with long limbs and eyes so dark and malevolent that you could clearly see them in the dim lighting. After I got my bearings, I looked upwards at the creature once again, just in time to see the thing pick up and rip Zimmerman in half in one fluid movement. I was no stranger to gore, but the sight of that was too much for even me to bear. I hunched over immediately after seeing this and vomited all over the cold cement floor. That ladder is my only hope of survival, I thought to myself, as I forced myself to a standing position. And as my eyes rose along with the rest of me, I could see the thing ripping and tearing through the people as they scattered in attempts to escape it. It was distracted, and as awful as it sounds, this was my only chance to get up that ladder. I forced my legs to move towards it, trying to block out the terrified screams of my fellow staff members and the unbearably loud music. I could hear gunshots coinciding with the screams and terrible sounds of flesh being ripped apart somewhere in the mess of noise. I reached my hands outwards and felt a wave of relief wash over me as my fingers came into contact with the hard metal rungs of the ladder. I gripped them and began to climb upwards as quickly as I could in my disoriented state, all the while praying that the monster would not see me, pull me off the ladder and back into the slaughter. I felt like at any moment I'd feel one of its smooth hands wrap around my ankles and pull me to my death. But I eventually made it to the top. There was no question in my mind. I had to close the hatch and seal that thing down there, even if it meant certain doom for my colleagues. I could not allow that thing to escape. I gripped the thick metal lid and began to push with all of my might in an attempt to seal the underground complex off. Despite how dense and sturdy it was, the lid was surprisingly easy to move, and it didn't take very much effort to push it over the hatch, even in my weakened state. In seconds, the hatch was completely covered by the dense metal lid. I collapsed on my side and began to vomit some more as exhaustion overtook me. And as I lay there, I realised something. Aside from my laboured breaths, the only thing I could hear was the faint echo of that song from down below. I felt as though I'd lose more of my sanity if I continued to lay there and listen to that song. So I once again forced myself to my feet and began to make my way to the wooden lodge I'd stayed in the previous night. It was where I'd left my baggage and also where I'd left the keys to my truck. Of the 15 staff members that took part in that forsaken experiment, I'm the only one who survived. I've never returned to the awful place where all of this happened, and I don't intend to. The project was very secretive, and Zimmerman was the only one who knew all of the details. As far as I know, no one is aware of my involvement, aside from me. In fact, I'm probably the only one who knows what the Harbinger experiment truly was, let alone what actually happened. By now, you're probably wondering why I've told you all about something none of you should be aware of. Maybe you're expecting me to give you a speech about not messing with things you don't understand, or something along those lines. I hope not, for I have no speech to give or lesson to impart. I began hearing a noise earlier today. Almost immediately, I recognised the noise as a very haunting and familiar song. I didn't even try to trace it to its source. I knew it would be pointless. And as the day has progressed, the song has increased in volume. It's loud enough now that I can very clearly make out the lyrics. I'm completely unable to escape the singer's voice. It's followed me everywhere I've gone. Subject 3 is coming for me, and I know that my time left in this world is extremely limited now. I guess you could say that I just wanted to tell the tale of the Harbinger experiment before it was lost forever. I hope that you will take some lesson from what I've recounted to you, but I think we both know you won't. Let's be honest, you don't believe a word of what I've just told you, and I don't blame you. I wouldn't believe me too if I were you. To you, this is nothing more than something to get your cheap thrills from. You were probably mindlessly surfing the internet when you clicked a link and found yourself here, wherever here may be, hearing this story. And to be honest, I don't care if you believe me or not. Even if you do, it probably won't stop you from trying to uncover the truth of a darkness that few of us have ever seen. It certainly never stopped Zimmerman. If you want a lesson, look at what happened to him when he went seeking the truth. I pray that none of you will ever discover this truth. I pray that none of you ever have to see the evil that I've seen. I hope that you all get to live in ignorance of what lies beyond the veil of what we can understand. It's here now. I can feel its black eyes burning into me, just as I could all those years ago. I'm as much to blame as Zimmerman is for the monstrosity that's now free to roam the world, even if I wasn't the one to create it. I'm sorry. Please, forgive me.